Imagine that every state in the US is its own country. In this scenario, the country of Oklahoma has the highest incarceration rate in the whole world, with 1,079 incarcerated people per 100,000 residents. The second country in the world would be Louisiana, with 1,052, followed by Mississippi, Georgia, Alabama, and the list goes on. It's not until number 32 on the list that a non-US state comes up, which is El Salvador at 614. 1 out of 5 incarcerated people in the world are located in the US, with a total prison population of 2.3 million, a population disproportionately represented by Black and brown people. It's innumerable the ways in which the prison industrial complex exploits incarcerated people and their families, but today we'll focus on one of the lesser-known ways in which incarcerated bodies are used by and for the powerful.
Now, Doctor, can we translate these tables on population into a picture of how Americans live?
Well, to a considerable extent, we certainly can.
1790 marked the first year of the census, but 1850 saw the first time that the census would attempt to record every member of every household, rather than just the name of the head of the household. It was also the first time that the census would count incarcerated people as residents of the prison they are confined in, and in turn of the towns those prisons are built in, rather than of their homes. This is significant for a lot of reasons that we'll get into in a moment, but before that I want to briefly touch on the topic of gerrymandering. You've probably seen them before on maps, or maybe you live in one of them. Those congressional districts that look something like this, or this, or this. Districts like these exist all across the country, and there are a couple reasons for that, but one of the more significant ones is gerrymandering. For the most part, congressional districts are redrawn every 10 years with a new census to account for population shifts. In 31 states, it's the state legislatures who redraw these lines. There are some restrictions on how these districts should be drawn, but the main thing is that they should have roughly the same population. And while racial gerrymandering was made illegal by the Voting Rights Act, the water is a lot murkier for partisan gerrymandering. The result of this is creative. Obviously, there's a lot of power in drawing these districts, as legislatures can essentially choose who votes where. But how do prisons factor into all of this? I think the best way to illustrate this would be with an example. Let's imagine you're a representative for the 1st congressional district of a state. Historically, this district has been composed of a town and its surrounding area. This year, however, the census has found that your district's population has declined by 500 people down to just 1,000 residents. This is a problem because your district is supposed to, at minimum, have 1,500 people, and so now there's talk that your district might be redrawn to include a suburb of B-Town, and they don't like you there. As you begin to realize that your reign in the House may be coming to an end, an idea comes to you. What about the prison just outside of your district? With 500 people incarcerated there, the prison could fix your population problem, and you don't have to worry about these new voters shaking up your base because people in prisons cannot vote, unless they're in Maine or Vermont. So to put it simply, prison gerrymandering is the inclusion of incarcerated people into the districts where they're being held as opposed to their permanent addresses. You might suggest lines be drawn like this. In a lot of states, this is supposed to be illegal, and yet it still happens. Let's take Wyoming's 3rd and 6th state Senate districts, for example. Senator Kurt Meyer, the incumbent of his district, lived right here. Senator Wayne Johnson, the incumbent of District 3, lived right here. Just like our example with A-Town, Meyer's district was looking to redraw its lines after the 2010 census. The Joint Interim Committee on Corporations, Elections, and Political Subdivisions proposed these new boundaries for the districts. See what's happened here? These new boundaries would pit Meyer against Johnson in a race that, by most counts, had Johnson winning. What did Myers do? Well, he spotted this little piece of land right here. What's here? A prison. Here was Meyer's proposed new district, and to not much of a surprise, this is the one that still exists to this day. Extreme cases of this exist all over this country, where towns' populations are more than 50% incarcerated people. So what's the impact of all this? Well, we should go back in time a bit. As we established earlier, the US has a staggering prison population, but it wasn't always this way. The dramatic spike in prison population began in the 80s, but we need to go back a bit further to New York in 1973, covered then by Nelson Rockefeller. In that year, Rockefeller would introduce something brand new that would go on to change the shape of America: mandatory minimums of 15 years to life for selling and possessing drugs. This new brand of tough-on-crime politics would go on to spread to other states, and eventually, the federal government, becoming one of the few truly bipartisan issues of the following decades. What followed from the Rockefeller laws was an unprecedented rise in incarceration rates, and although white people used drugs at about the same rate as black people, these new numbers didn't reflect that. So what follows from a dramatic increase in prison populations? A dramatic increase in prison construction. And where these prisons were being built is really important to consider because prior to 1980, only 36% of prisons were located in rural areas. During the 1960s and 70s, an average of 4 prisons were being built annually in these mostly white and Republican parts of the country. Why this is significant to prison gerrymandering is because that meant that incarcerated people were still being confined near their homes, so when the census would count them, it wouldn't disturb the numbers of their districts. In the 80s, however, prison construction in rural areas jumped to 16 new prisons being built per year, and in the 90s, it was up to 25. During the 90s alone, 245 prisons were built in rural communities. The reason for this was that these communities, impacted by the loss of jobs in manufacturing, mining, and agriculture, saw prisons as a steady economic boon. So let's review. A disproportionate amount of black and brown people are being incarcerated at skyrocketing numbers, leaving their home communities and being spread out across their state, oftentimes to be counted as residents of communities that are economically dependent on these prisons running. And, as we saw in our examples before, this is extremely beneficial to the representatives of these communities as well. It's a multifaceted problem, but just as it relates to vote manipulation, it's clear how small communities boost their political clout by both building new prisons in their districts and roping in prisons with redistricting, while also doubling the effect by taking away the power of these incarcerated people's home districts. A stark example of this can be seen in Illinois, where 60% of Illinois' prisoners are from Cook County, yet 99% of them are counted outside the county. As the year 2020 comes to a close, prison gerrymandering is still widely practiced in this country, and with this year's census complete, we'll soon see a period of redistricting that will undoubtedly involve this same packing of districts. So the question now is, what's being done about this? Back in 2011, New York and Maryland prohibited prison gerrymandering during their redistricting process, and with the upcoming redistricting cycle, California, Colorado, Delaware, Nevada, New Jersey, Virginia, and Washington will join them. Additionally, in 2010, the Census Bureau released its report on prison counts earlier than it had in the past, in order to help states redistrict with that in mind. And for the upcoming redistricting, the report will come out even earlier. Momentum is building in the fight against prison gerrymandering, and soon we may see its full abolition. But it's also important to remember that this is just one part of the massive issue that is the prison industrial complex's grip on America.